When a respected detective is arrested on shocking charges, his family is left reeling, but as his teenage son uncovers a trail of buried secrets and damning evidence, the case takes a dangerous twist. What begins as a fight for justice becomes a harrowing race against time to clear his father's name before it's too late. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And as always, if you stand for justice, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the rusted tin roof of a warehouse tucked away on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a group of figures moved with a sense of urgency, their faces obscured by hooded jackets. The room was cluttered with crates stacked haphazard, their sides stamped with foreign insignias and cryptic codes. The air was thick with a pungent smell of damp wood and gun oil, the acrid scent of cash distinct, even when wet lingered in the background, adding a layer of tension to the charged atmosphere. At the center of it all stood a figure with an unmistakable air of authority. The person barked orders sharply, their tone brooking no argument. "Keep it moving, we don't have all night," they snapped, their voice cutting through the low hum of activity. The crew worked efficiently, transferring bundles of cash and unregistered firearms into an unmarked van parked near a loading bay. The rhythmic clink of metal and the rustle of bills punctuated the storm. Outside, despite the urgency of the operation, there was a grim precision to the way the figure oversaw every detail. Each crate was checked twice before being loaded, the slightest misstep corrected with a glare that froze the recipient in their tracks. This wasn't their first time running an operation like this, and it showed. The tension in the room shifted abruptly when a sound broke the rhythm of their movements. A faint scuffle followed by the crunch of glass underfoot echoed from a shadowed corner of the warehouse. The crew froze mid-motion, their heads snapping toward the noise. The figure in charge stiffened, their hand instinctively hovering near the holster on their hip. "Who's there?" the figure demanded, their voice low but menacing. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the source of the sound. A man in his mid-30s, soaked from the rain, his chest heaved as if he had been running, and his eyes darted wildly around the room. He raised his hands in surrender, palms outward, trembling as they caught the light weight. I didn't see anything," the man stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. His gaze flicked nervously toward the van where crates of contraband sat partially loaded. He took an involuntary step backward, his boots scraping against the wet concrete floor. The figure in charge narrowed their eyes, assessing the man with a cold detachment. The grip on their weapon tightened. "You shouldn't be here," they said, their tone devoid of empathy. "Please," the man pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "I swear I won't say anything. I'll just..." The crack of a gunshot cut him off mid-sentence. The sound reverberated through the cavernous space, momentarily overpowering even the relentless rain. The man collapsed in a heap, his body sprawled awkwardly on the ground, blood pooled beneath him, the crimson spreading slowly across the slick concrete. His lifeless eyes stared unblinkingly at the flickering light above. The figure holstered their weapon with a practiced motion, their expression unchanged. The crew remained frozen for a beat, the weight of what had just occurred hanging heavily in the air. Then, with a sharp command, the figure snapped them back into action. "Clean it up." From the shadows, a second figure emerged. They avoided the spreading pool of blood as they grabbed the man's legs, dragging the body toward the van. The sound of fabric scraping against concrete mingled with the steady drum of the rain. The group worked quickly, staging the scene to look like a botched robbery. Crates were overturned and cash was scattered carelessly across the floor. The figure in charge oversaw every detail, ensuring there were no loose ends. "Make sure the cameras are wiped," they added, their voice calm but firm. One of the crew nodded and hurried to a small office tucked into the corner of the warehouse. Inside, an outdated surveillance system hummed quietly, its screens flickering with grainy black and white images. A few keystrokes later, the footage from the night was erased, leaving no trace of the operation or the murder. Satisfied, the figure glanced around the warehouse one last time. The crew was already finishing the cleanup, wiping down surfaces and loading the last of the crates into the van. The precision of their movements reflected years of practice. This wasn't an amateur Operation, this was something far more sinister honed by repetition. Let's go, the figure ordered. The crew didn't need to be told twice. They climbed into the van, leaving behind only a carefully staged scene and the faintest trace of their presence. The van rumbled to life, its engine nearly drowned out by the storm. As it disappeared into the night, the warehouse fell silent once more. The only evidence of the crime, a faint trail of blood, was gradually washed away by the relentless rain, merging with the murky puddles pooling along the cracked concrete floor. Outside, the storm continued unabated, the city's lights a distant glow on the horizon. The rain washed away the blood, the tracks, and the lingering echoes of violence, leaving behind only questions that no one was yet asking. 2 days after the warehouse crime, the early morning tranquility at the Johnson residence was shattered by an unexpected knock at the door. The sound was deliberate, sharp, and unrelenting, more commanding than casual. Michael Johnson, a veteran cop with over 2 decades of service, glanced up from his coffee at the kitchen table. He exchanged a puzzled look with his wife, Claire, before setting his mug down. "That's not the mailman," he said with a small forked chuckle, though unease flickered in his eyes when he opened the door. His confusion deepened. Standing on the porch was his closest friend and longtime partner, Officer Gerald Vance, dressed in his full uniform. Vance's face was grim, his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on Michael's. Behind him, a team of officers stood in formation, accompanied by 2 agents from Internal Affairs. The sight of their badges glinting in the morning sunlight made Michael's stomach lurch. "Gerald," Michael said, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Vance's voice was cold, emotionless. "Michael Johnson," he said, pausing deliberately. "You're under arrest for theft, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to traffic illegal firearms, and murder." Michael froze, the weight of the words hitting him like a blow to the chest. What he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "Gerald, this has to be some kind of mistake." Vance's expression didn't waver. "The evidence doesn't lie, Michael," he said, motioning for the Internal Affairs officers to step forward. Michael's hands instinctively rose in a gesture of surrender as the agents moved in, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Gerald," he pleaded, his voice cracking with disbelief, "you know me, you've known me for years, you know I would never save it for the courtroom." Vance interrupted, his tone cutting and final. "You'll have your chance to explain." The cold steel of the cuffs clicked around Michael's wrists, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. Claire appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale and her eyes dry with disbelief. "Gerald, what are you doing?" she demanded, rushing down the stairs. "This is ridiculous. Michael hasn't done anything wrong." One of the Internal Affairs agents stepped between her and Michael, his voice calm but unyielding. "Mrs. Johnson, we have substantial evidence implicating your husband. Please step back." Claire's gaze darted to Vance, desperate for an explanation. "Gerald, you've been his partner for years. You can't possibly believe he's capable of murder." For a moment, Vance's eyes flickered with something, regret, hesitation, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'll make sure this is handled fairly," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Fairly?" Claire repeated, her voice rising. "Dragging him out of here like a criminal. This is fair to you." Michael turned his head, his voice firm but pained. "Claire, stop, don't make this harder on yourself." He looked at her, then at their 17-year-old son, Ethan, who had appeared in the hallway. Ethan stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. "Dad," Ethan's voice cracked, his gaze darting between his father and Vance. "What's going on? Why are they taking you?" Michael's expression softened, but his words were deliberate. "Ethan, listen to me. Stay with your mom. This is going to be okay, I promise." Ethan's eyes flicked to Vance, his face twisting in anger and confusion. "Gerald," he said, his voice trembling, "how can you do this? You know my dad didn't do this." Vance avoided Ethan's gaze, instead motioning for the officers to proceed. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said, his tone detached. The patrol car door slammed shut, and the engine roared to life, pulling away from the curve. Ethan stood motionless, his heart pounding as he watched the car disappear down the street. Claire wrapped her arms around him, but her own tears did little to soften the crushing weight of the moment. Inside the house, the silence was oppressive. Claire paced the living room, her hands trembling as she struggled to process what had just happened. "Murder," she whispered, shaking her head. "They're accusing Michael of murder. How could they even?" Ethan sat on the couch, his fists Still clenched his thoughts, a chaotic mess. What kind of evidence do they have? He asked, his voice sharp. They have to know Dad wouldn't do this. He's the best cop they have. Claw's voice broke as she replied, I don't know, Ethan, I don't know, but Gerald wouldn't do this. Unless she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Ethan stood abruptly, his frustration boiling over. Unless what? Unless he thinks it's true. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. It doesn't make any sense. Dad's been a cop for 20 years. He's never even bent the rules, let alone this. Claire tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by the knot of anger and fear tightening in Ethan's chest. He stormed upstairs to his room, slamming the door behind him. At the precinct, Michael sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, the walls closing in around him across the table. Vance sat silently, a thick file folder in front of him. The folder contained photographs, financial records, and crime scene evidence, each piece seemingly damning. You know, this isn't true, Michael said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. I don't know what you think you found, but you're wrong. Vance's eyes remained on the folder as he flipped through the pages. You're not making this easy, Michael, he said finally. I've seen the evidence myself, the financial records, the emails. And we have a witness who places you at the scene of the murder. Michael leaned forward, his voice low and steady. You're being played, Gerald. Someone's setting me up, and you're falling for it. Vance looked up, his expression hard. And who would that be, Michael? Because all the evidence points to you. Michael's jaw tightened. You'll figure it out. I just hope it's before it's too late. Vance closed the file with a snap and stood. We'll see, he said before walking out of the room, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. Who do you think framed Michael? Could it be someone close to him? Share your thoughts below, give this video a like, and keep watching to find out. The silence in the Johnson household was suffocating. Claire had retreated to her bedroom, emotionally drained, while Ethan sat alone at the dining table, his father's arrest replayed in his mind on an endless loop. The sight of his hero in handcuffs, the cold betrayal in Vance's voice, and the haunting accusations of murder. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, the frustration and disbelief bubbling just beneath the surface. He wouldn't accept it. He couldn't. His dad wasn't capable of the crimes they were accusing him of, least of all murder. The thought alone made Ethan's stomach churn, but the question remained, why would someone like Vance, practically family to them, lead the charge against his father? Ethan knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to sit by and do nothing. Ethan's bedroom became a war zone of papers and files. He had gathered every scrap of his father's old casework he could find in the house, spreading them across his desk, bed, and floor. Stacks of news articles about the alleged trafficking ring were pinned to a corkboard he borrowed from the garage, rendering connected points of interest, like in the crime shows his dad used to watch with him. But as Ethan scanned the headlines and dug deeper into the charges, he began to notice cracks in the story. The timelines didn't align perfectly, and key details were frustratingly vague. How had his father supposedly orchestrated an entire operation without raising suspicion from his fellow officers? Why did the evidence conveniently point to him and only him among the chaos? Ethan unearthed a worn leather notebook from his father's personal effects, a journal he'd never seen before. The pages were filled with Michael's meticulous handwriting, case notes, observations, and suspicions. One entry, dated just a month before his arrest, stopped Ethan cold. Unreported contraband. Gerald dismissive. Ethan stared at the page, his mind racing. Why would his dad have documented suspicion about Vance? Could this be connected to the charges against him? If his father had been digging into something, and if Vance had dismissed his concerns, then there was a chance Michael's investigation had made him a target. The idea sent a chill down Ethan's spine, but it also gave him hope. If he could find out what his dad had been working on, maybe he could prove his innocence. The next day, Ethan reached out to the only person he could think of who might help: Rachel Cortez, his father's former partner. Rachel had been reassigned to another precinct years ago, but she and Michael had always kept in touch. Ethan found her number on a scrap of paper in one of his dad's old files and called her from the privacy of his room. Hello. Rachel's voice was cautious. Unsure. Detective Cortez, "This is Ethan Johnson," he said quickly, Michael's son. "Son," there was a pause. "Ethan, I heard about your dad. I'm sorry. I wish there was something I could do. That's why I'm calling." Ethan said, his tone firm. "I think my dad is being set up. I need your help to prove it." Rachel sighed on the other end of the line. "Ethan, I don't know what you've heard, but the evidence against your father is overwhelming. Even if I wanted to help, there's not much I can do." "You don't understand," Ethan insisted. "I found his notebook. He wrote about Vance, about how he didn't report some contraband. My dad was onto something big, and Vance shut him down. I think Vance is framing him." The mention of Vance gave Rachel pause. "Gerald Vance?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He's the one who arrested your dad?" "Yes," Ethan said, "and I think he's hiding something." Rachel let out a long breath. "Look, Ethan, even if what you're saying is true, going after Vance isn't just risky, it's career suicide. I'd need actual evidence, not just your dad's suspicions." "I know," Ethan said, undeterred. "That's why I need your help. You worked with my dad for years. You know the kind of cop he is. Please just hear me out." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Rachel finally spoke. "Okay," she said reluctantly. "I'll meet with you. But I'm warning you, if you're wrong about this, it could ruin Michael and me. Do you understand?" "I understand," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I won't waste your time." Ethan and Rachel met at a small diner on the edge of town. Rachel was in plain clothes, her sharp eyes scanning the room before sliding into the booth across from Ethan. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, the stress of her job and the weight of Michael's arrest clearly taking their toll. "All right, kid," she said, leaning forward. "What have you got?" Ethan pulled out the notebook and placed it on the table. "My dad wrote this a month before he was arrested," he said, flipping to the marked page. "He mentions unreported contraband and how Vance dismissed it. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" Rachel studied the entry, her expression unreadable. "It's interesting," she admitted, "but it's not enough to prove anything. This could mean anything. Look at the timing." Ethan pressed. "A month later, my dad is accused of trafficking illegal firearms, the same kind of contraband he tried to report. Doesn't that feel like more than a coincidence?" Rachel hesitated, her gaze flicking to the notebook again. "You said your dad was on to something big. Do you have any idea what?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet, but I'm going to find out. Will you help me?" Rachel sat back, crossing her arms as she weighed her options. Ethan's determination reminded her of Michael, unwavering and relentless. She sighed. "All right," she said, "I'll help you, but we do this my way. No reckless moves, no half-baked theories. We stick to the facts, and we don't go after Vance unless we have something solid." Deal, Ethan said, relief washing over him. Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "First things first, we need access to Michael's case files. If there's a paper trail, that's where we'll find it." Ethan sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a mug of cold coffee as he stared at a map of the city spread out in front of him. Bright red circles marked several locations: police storage facilities, known trafficking hotspots, and the warehouse mentioned in his father's case. Files, a notepad filled with scrolled dates and cryptic references, sat at his side alongside a stack of photocopied precinct records. Rachel had helped him obtain. The more he studied, the clearer it became that none of it added up. Why would they make Dad the fall guy? Ethan muttered to himself. He flipped through the records again, focusing on Vance's actions leading up to Michael's arrest. The report made Vance out to be a relentless investigator who had heroically uncovered a trafficking operation within the precinct. But Ethan had grown up around cops. He knew when a story was too neat. Picking up his phone, Ethan scanned a recent press interview Vance had given. The man's tone was polished, his words carefully chosen, but Ethan caught something that made him pause. The timeline Vance described didn't match the dates in the precinct records. "He's lying," Ethan whispered, his pulse quickening. He grabbed a pen and jotted down his observations, trying to piece together a pattern. Later that evening, Ethan met Rachel Cortez at a conf shop near her precinct. She arrived wearing a leather jacket and an expression that conveyed equal parts exhaustion and determination. "All right, kid," she said, sliding into the booth. "What's the latest?" Ethan pushed his notes toward her. "I've been looking into the case records in Vance's testimony. The timeline doesn't makes sense. Vance claims my dad was under investigation for months, but there's no evidence that he was even being watched until right before the arrest. Rachel leaned forward, skimming through Ethan's notes. You think Vance fabricated the investigation? I think he controlled it. Ethan replied, he's the one who found the evidence against my dad. He's the one who made the arrest. And he's the one who's been front and center in every report about the case. Rachel frowned her eyes, narrowing. You're saying he planted the evidence? Ethan nodded. It's possible. Look at this. He handed her a print out of precinct records. He had requested it earlier. My dad was working on a case involving missing persons and stolen weapons before he was arrested. This file stood out to me because Vance logged multiple visits to the site where the evidence was stored, the same site linked to the trafficking ring. Rachel studied the document, her jaw tightening. That's a red flag, she admitted. Why would Vance make so many trips to a storage site unless he was actively working a case there? And why isn't that in his testimony? That's what I want to find out, Ethan said. I think the answer is at that warehouse. Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms. Ethan going to that warehouse isn't just risky, it's dangerous. If Vance is hiding something, he'll do whatever it takes to protect it. The night was cool. The distant hum of crickets occasionally interrupted by the sound of passing cars. Ethan and Rachel parked a block away from the warehouse, using the shadows of nearby buildings as cover. The towering structure stood silent and imposing, its corrugated metal exterior reflecting faint moonlight. A faint breeze carried the scent of oil and mildew, heightening the tension between the two. As they approached the side entrance, Rachel reached the door first and tested the handle lock. She whispered. She pulled out a small tool kit from her jacket pocket. Watch my six while I work on this. Ethan nodded, his flashlight off as he scanned their surroundings. His heart pounded in his chest as Rachel expertly manipulated the lock. After what felt like an eternity, a soft click broke the silence, wherein Rachel said, pushing the door open slowly. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit, a few weak overhead lights casting uneven shadows across the expansive space. Rows of towering metal shelves and wooden crates filled the area, stretching into the distance. The air was thick, carrying the faint smell of rust and something metallic, almost like blood. Stay close, Rachel instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. Ethan swept his flashlight across the room, revealing faded markings on crates, each stamped with cryptic alphanumeric codes. Rachel examined one of the boxes and frowned. These mark workings, they're not standard inventory tags. This isn't precinct storage, she muttered. This is off the books. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he pointed his flashlight at a cluster of crates stacked higher than the others. What are they hiding? He asked, more to himself than Rachel. The two pressed deeper into the warehouse, their flashlights revealing more of the same crates filled with equipment, industrial tools, and sealed boxes, but nothing concrete stood out. And until they reached the far end of the space, Ethan's flashlight beam caught something odd, a section of the wall that didn't match the rest. The metal panels here looked newer, cleaner, and slightly misaligned. A sense of unease settled over him as he approached Rachel. Look at this, he called softly. Rachel joined him, her flashlight tracing the edges of the wall. She ran her fingers over the seam. This is a compartment, she said, her voice low and tense. Help me move this panel. With effort they opened the hidden section, revealing a recessed area filled with carefully stacked crates. The sight made Rachel inhale sharply. Ethan froze, his eyes widening. The crates weren't just filled with random supplies, they were packed with unregistered firearms, wads of cash bound in rubber bands, and forged documents. Rachel sifted through one of the open boxes, her expression grim. This is a tring operation, she murmured. Your dad was right. Ethan's gaze shifted to a smaller box tucked into the corner of the compartment. He opened it hesitantly and felt his stomach twist. Inside were personal items, a necklace, a wallet, even a child's toy car. He recognized some of the names from the missing persons reports. His father had flagged. A lump formed in his throat as he processed the horrifying implication. They're connected to the missing persons, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. This isn't just trafficking, they're targeting people. Rachel nodded grimly. This is bigger than I thought. Ethan pulled out his phone and began taking photos of everything, the crates, the contents, the markings, every piece of evidence. Mattered as he snapped a picture of the personal items. His hand trembled. He couldn't stop thinking about the lives ruined by whoever was behind. This Rachel, meanwhile, opened a ledger tucked inside one of the crates. Her eyes scanned the pages, narrowing at the columns of coded entries. These are shipment records, she said. Dates, locations, payouts, all coded. Someone's keeping track of the operation. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, reading the neat, almost mechanical handwriting. His eyes caught a few initials scrolled beside some of the entries. GVGV. He whispered, "Do you think that's Vance?" Rachel hesitated. "It's possible, but we need more than initials to make that connection. Let's get out of here before we're caught." As they prepared to leave, Rachel's flashlight beam caught something tucked high in the corner of the room, a faint glint of glass. She froze, her blood running cold. "Ethan," she said softly. "Don't move." "What?" Ethan asked, his voice low but sharp. Rachel pointed toward the corner. "There's a camera." Ethan's breath hitched as he followed her gaze. Sure enough, a small security camera was mounted discreetly above the crates, its lens angled toward the compartment. It was old and unassuming, but the red indicator light blinking faintly told them everything they needed to know. "Someone had been watching. Do you think it's live?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the exit. Doesn't matter," she said. "We need to go now." As they moved quickly toward the door, the faint hum of the warehouse lights suddenly intensified. Motion activated bulbs flickered to life, illuminating the space in harsh white light. The shadows vanished, leaving them exposed. "Run!" Rachel barked. Ethan clutched the ledger to his chest as they sprinted through the rows of crates. His heart thundered in his ears, his legs burning with effort behind them. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, growing louder with every second. The cool night air hit them like a wall as they burst out of the warehouse. Rachel didn't stop running until they reached the car parked under the cover of a tree. Ethan scrambled into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut as Rachel started the engine. "Did they see us?" Ethan asked breathlessly, glancing over his shoulder. Rachel's eyes darted to the rearview mirror as she sped away. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we've got what we need." Ethan clutched the ledger tightly, his mind reeling from the night's events. The images of the crates, the personal items, and the camera were seared into his memory. For the first time they had tangible evidence, proof of a massive operation, and a trail that could lead straight to Vance. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a knowing unease settled over Ethan. Whoever was behind this wouldn't take kindly to their discovery. They had a lead, but it came with a price, and deep down Ethan knew their fight was just beginning. Ethan sat at his desk, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the scattered papers and photographs. Before him, his fingers traced the lines of the ledger they had retrieved from the warehouse, the entries written in a neat, cryptic hand. Each line was a thread connecting shipments of weapons, bundles of sea ash, and a chilling number of names tied to missing persons reports. The initials GV appeared again and again like a dark signature, marking every critical transaction. Why would he leave a trail this obvious? Ethan muttered, jotting notes on a legal pad. He felt the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. This was no longer about just his father's innocence. The evidence in his hands implicated someone within law enforcement, someone who wielded power to or estate such a massive operation. Rachel sat across the room, flipping through precinct records on her laptop. Her jaw tightened as she found more inconsistencies. "Ethan, look at this," she said, motioning him over. "Vance logged visits to the warehouse over 6 months, but there's no official documentation of what he was doing there. It's like he was invisible." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, scanning the screen. The timeline aligned too perfectly with the co-entries in the ledger. "This proves he was there," Ethan said, his voice tense. "But it's not enough. We need a direct connection to the trafficking operation." Rachel's eyes softened as she studied Ethan's determined face. "We got enough to cast doubt on Vance's credibility, at least," she said. "But Ethan, this is dangerous. If Vance realizes we're onto him." Rachel's words were cut short by a knock at the door. Ethan's mom, CLA, stepped into the room, her face tight with worry. She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway as her eyes darted between Ethan "And Rachel, what's going on in here?" Claire asked, her tone firm but weary. She glanced at the papers spread across Ethan's desk, and the intensity etched on her son's face. "Ethan, you've barely been sleeping. Now you've got someone from the precinct involved. What are you doing?" Ethan straightened, trying to keep his voice calm. "Mom, I'm working on clearing Dad's name." Claire's eyes narrowed. "By putting yourself in danger, Ethan. This isn't a school project. These people you're up against, they don't play by the rules." Rachel stood, her expression apologetic. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand your concerns. Believe me, I've tried to talk him out of some of this. But he's not listening." CLA interrupted, her voice cracking slightly. She turned to Ethan, her worry spilling over into frustration. "I already lost your dad to this mess. Can't lose you too." Ethan stepped closer to his mom, his voice soft but resolute. "I'm careful, Mom, I promise. But if I don't do this, Dad's going to prison for something he didn't do. I can't just sit back and let that happen." Claire's shoulders sagged as she processed his words. She looked at Rachel, her eyes pleading. "You're a cop. You know what this world is like. You're supposed to protect people. Can you promise me you'll protect my son?" Rachel hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I'll do everything I can." It wasn't the reassurance Claire wanted, but she sighed, placing a hand on Ethan's cheek. "Just don't forget, you're all I've got left right now." Ethan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I won't." Miles away, Gerald Vance sat in his dimly lit living room, a drink in hand, and his phone buzzing on the table. A message from a known informant appeared on the screen. "The kid and Cortez have the ledger. They've been digging deep." Vance's jaw tightened as he stared at the message. He had spent years building his reputation, hiding his actions beneath the veneer of a respected officer. If Ethan succeeded in unraveling his carefully constructed web, everything would crumble. He drained his drink, a grim determination settling over him. He couldn't afford to let Ethan continue. The sun was just beginning to rise when Ethan stepped into his car, the ledger safely tucked into his backpack. Despite the long night, his mind buzzed with adrenaline as he prepared to meet Rachel. He had barely driven a mile when the brakes began to feel strange, the pedal losing resistance with each press. At first, he thought it was fatigue playing tricks on him, but as he approached a sharp curve, he pressed the brake firmly, and the car didn't slow. Panic surged through him as he gripped the wheel, yanking it hard to avoid oncoming traffic. The tires screeched and the car kenned off the road, slamming into a ditch with a violent jolt. Ethan's world spun, his head hitting the steering wheel with enough force to blur his vision. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as the engine sputtered and died. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint sound of his own ragged breathing. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed Rachel. "Rachel," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something happened." The car brakes. Ethan. Rachel's voice was sharp with alarm. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm not far from you." He managed. "The brakes failed. Someone tampered with the car." Rachel didn't waste a second. She grabbed her keys and sped toward the area, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. When she reached the scene, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan's car lay at an angle in the ditch, the front end crumpled against a tree. "Ethan," she yelled, jumping out of her car and rushing to the wreckage inside. Ethan stirred, his face pale and blood streaking his forehead. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice weak. "I've got you," she said firmly, pulling open the mangled door. "Can you move?" Ethan winced as she helped him out of the car, her arms steadying him as he stumbled onto solid ground. "The brakes, they didn't work," he mumbled, clutching his side. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the car. "Stay here," she ordered, pulling a flashlight from her pocket. She crouched by the car, examining the undercarriage. It didn't take long to spot the problem. The brake lines had been cleanly severed. Her stomach churned as she realized the deliberate nature of the sabotage. "Someone did this," she muttered under her breath. Standing, she returned to Ethan and draped his arm over her shoulder. "Come on, we need to get out of here." Rachel drove Ethan to a secluded spot far from prying eyes. She parked and turned to him, her voice low but urgent. "Ethan, this wasn't an accident." Ethan's jaw clenched. "It was Vance," he said bitterly. "He wanted me out of the way." Rachel nodded grimly. "We can't let him know you survived. If he thinks you're still a threat, he'll come after you again." Ethan's mind raced, the adrenaline keeping him sharp despite his injuries. "We stay quiet," He said, "Let him think I'm done that way. He'll let his guard down." The news of Ethan's accident spread quickly at the precinct. Vance leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips as he overheard an officer discussing it. "That Johnson kid, yeah, sounds bad. Car went off the road. Car's total." Vance felt a fleeting pang of regret, quickly smothered by his need for self-preservation. As far as he was concerned, the problem had resolved itself. Ethan was out of the picture, and with the trial approaching, all he had to do was ensure Michael's conviction. He left the precinct that day with a renewed sense of confidence, unaware that Ethan's resolve had only hardened. The courtroom brimmed with tension as the trial began. Reporters lined the back, whispering among themselves, while spectators filled the gallery. Michael Johnson sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The weight of the accusations bore down on him, evident in the faint lines of exhaustion etched into his face. To his left, his lawyer shuffled through stacks of documents, murmuring last-minute strategies. Across the aisle, Gerald Vance adjusted his uniform and took the stand. The prosecution's star witness exuded confidence, his every gesture carefully measured to convey authority and trustworthiness. He straightened his tie and glanced briefly at Michael, his expression a calculated mixture of regret and determination. "I knew Michael for over a decade." Vance began, his voice steady, tinged with sadness. "He was more than a partner, he was a friend. That's what makes this so difficult." The prosecutor approached, projecting an air of assured control. "Officer Vance, can you walk us through how you came to uncover evidence against Officer Johnson?" Vance nodded, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "It started with discrepancies in precinct records. Financial reports didn't align with our operations. Missing evidence logs raised red flags, and after following those leads, I uncovered emails and transaction records tying Michael to several illegal shipments. The trail eventually led to a locker at the precinct where personal items linked to several missing persons were discovered." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Michael clenched his jaw but said nothing, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm to hold him steady. "And these personal items?" the prosecutor asked. "Can you confirm their relevance to the case?" "They match descriptions from active missing persons cases," Vance replied solemnly. "Wallets, watches, even a necklace reported stolen during a suspected trafficking incident, all found in a locker assigned to Michael Johnson." The prosecutor stepped closer to Vance, nodding gravely. "And what else did you find?" Vance's gaze darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Bank transfers from accounts under his name to offshore accounts tied to known traffickers. The pattern was clear." The prosecutor paused, allowing the gravity of the evidence to settle over the room. "Officer Vance," he said, his voice dropping for effect, "what was your reaction when you realized this evidence pointed to someone you trusted?" Vance sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "It was devastating. Betrayal is an understatement."